Thank you, Benji, for that introduction. We appreciate your helping us celebrate this, the 50th anniversary of the Environmental Protection Agency. I am so pleased to welcome everyone to the Nixon Foundation. We are celebrating on December 2nd, 2020 at the Nixon Foundation, President Nixon signing an executive order that brought the agency into being. That followed, of course, earlier in the year, his signing of the National Environmental Policy Act. And we've assembled a great panel of experts who are here to talk about the past 50 years and I think look forward as well. I'm pleased to welcome Christine Todd Whitman. Governor Whitman is a president of the Whitman Strategy Group, a consulting firm that specializes in energy and environmental issues. Governor Whitman served under President George W. Bush as administrator of the EPA from January of 2001 until 2003 of June of that year. She was the 50th governor of the state of New Jersey, serving as its first woman governor from 1994 until 2001. As governor, Christie Whitman earned praise from both Republicans and Democrats for her commitment to preserve a record amount of New Jersey land as permanent green space. She's also recognized by the Natural Resources Defense Council as having instituted the most comprehensive beach monitoring system in the nation. As EPA Administrator, she promoted common sense environmental improvements such as watershed-based water protection policies. Governor Whitman also championed regulations requiring non-road diesel engines to reduce sulfur emissions by more than 95% and a host of other environmentally crucial innovations. William Reilly was the administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency under President George H.W. Bush. He served as the president of the World Wildlife Fund, as the founder or advisor to several business ventures, on many boards of directors. In 2010, he was appointed by President Barack Obama to co-chair the National Commission on the BP Deepwater Horizon oil spill and offshore drilling to investigate the oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico. James Strock served as the founding secretary of the California Environmental Protection Agency. He had previously served as assistant administrator for the United States Environmental Protection Agency, counsel to the U.S. Senate Environment and Public Works Committee, acting agency director at the Office of Personnel Management. Christopher DeMuth is a distinguished fellow at the Hudson Institute in Washington, D.C., the former president of the AEI, the American Enterprise Institute, from 1986 to 2008. He was a staff assistant to President Richard Nixon in his teens, I would guess, and chairman of the White House Task Force on Environmental Policy, involved in preparing President Nixon's environmental message and legislative proposals to Congress in February of 1970, and with the establishment of the EPA, the executive reorganization of December 1970. Later, during President Reagan's first term, he was administrator of the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs at the Office of Management and Budget, and executive director of the Presidential Task Force on Regulatory Relief, responsible for reviewing the regulatory initiatives of EPA and other agencies. And last but not least, Roger Turner is a research curator at the Science History Institute in Philadelphia, where he researches connections between atmospheric science and environmental management during the 20th century. His research has been supported by fellowships from the National Science Foundation, the American Meteorological Society, and the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum. He earned his doctorate in history and sociology of science from the University of Pennsylvania in 2010. Welcome to you all. That was a mouthful, but it sets the stage for what I hope is a credentialed and serious conversation, not just of the past 50 years, but the next. And if I can, Governor Whitman, I want to begin with you. When we do this again in 50 years, when we are doing the centenary of the EPA, probably at the Nixon Library, what do you hope the agency will have done in the next 50 years that it has not yet done thus far?
The agency needs to be able to move ahead to address issues like climate change. Water quality is going to continue to be a challenge, water quantity and quality, and they're all wrapped up together. But really, the main thing is going to be over the next few years to getting a commitment that this is important, that what happens in our environment is critical to our health. It is critical to our way of life. We have to get the respect back for that. I think the average person actually, in point of fact, understands how critical the environment, a healthy environment is to a healthy economy, to their lifestyles, and that they see things like climate change are real and they are occurring. But they want to take action. But unfortunately, we haven't had the commitment at the federal level. So I expect that over the next few years anyway, and that's certainly going to take us a long, long time. I mean, we're not going to stop climate change, but we have to slow it down. We have to adapt. We have to see what we can do, everything we can do. And there's so much more to learn about our natural environment and ways in which we can be productive and protective And so that's where I hope we're going to be in the next 50 years. We get the agency back to doing what it was mandated to do, protect human health and the environment.
Administrator Reilly, what's your take on that?
I think that the next generation taking us toward that 100th anniversary will be the one where we either do or do not figure out how to address the climate problem, both from the point of view of mitigation, which is going to be a substantial reorientation of the American economy away from fossil fuels in favor of new technologies that can capture carbon from the air, and seaweed cultivation, farming on a very large scale, the kinds of things that can do very serious, what's called negative emissions capture. That is to take out some of the accumulated carbon that's already in the air, which is a very delicate kind of thing to do. There is a technology to do it, and there's more than a technology. There are natural systems that can do it. My sense is that EPA is well positioned, especially given its history in the 1970s and 80s of expending a couple of $1 billion a year on wastewater treatment plants without fraud, without embarrassment, without corruption, that it could undertake the major role in the infrastructure, the adaptation that's going to be necessary, particularly in the coastal areas, to manage sea level rise. That will happen, I think, within 5 to 10 years. It will turn out to be necessary. We will see coastal areas begin to get afflicted. I think that it's a very short time frame before we see the financial markets and insurance, mortgage guarantees and things of that sort begin to adapt to a realization that we're entering a much more challenging era. And the culture, not just the economy, the culture itself is going to have to change. We're not yet, I think, aware of that. As I looked at the exit polls for the recent election, I didn't see anybody who voted climate. It wasn't a category that came up. The pandemic and the economy were the two leading issues. I'm reminded that when Nixon in 1968 decided to have his campaign stress the environment, and then later when elected told his advisors to get out front on the environment, he saw that the environment was number 3 in public recognition and priority after the war in Vietnam and the economy. Well, the environment had never played in that league before, and he perceived that the culture then had changed, was changing, and Earth Day 1970 made that clear. I think we need to take the same approach now, only it's not so likely to come from the bottom up as I think it needs leadership from the top to clarify for the country the significance of the problem and the importance of the moment. The fact that it's a problem that will become more and more difficult to manage the longer we put off dealing with it.
Chris DeMuth, you were there when President Nixon began his initiatives. How do you think they will stand over the next 50 years?
The EPA has been a hugely successful agency and program of the federal government over the last 50 years. When I was first working on these matters for President Nixon in the summer of 1969, Washington was covered by a heavy brown haze essentially every day. And there's no industry in Washington. It was just automobiles. The EPA regulation has been controversial. Things change from one administration to another, and people argue about over-regulation or insufficient regulation. But there has been steady progress in all of the major areas that EPA has worked in: land pollution, air and water pollution, over the past 50 years. I think in the next 50 years, there's going to be, I think the major challenge is going to be climate change. And I think that the apparatus for getting serious about climate change issues is going to migrate from the EPA, because I think its regulatory authorities are inadequate to the challenge, and move increasingly to the Congress. In 1970, President Nixon proposed using taxes as a means of addressing environmental problems. Nobody was listening to him. Nobody knew what he was talking about. He proposed a tax on lead in gasoline. A few years later, he proposed a national tax on sulfur dioxide. Couldn't find a single member of the House of either party to support it. But ideas to address climate change in a serious way are going to have to involve putting a tax on carbon of one sort or another. That's something that EPA cannot do. It's something that legislators have to become involved in. So I think that EPA will continue to play an important role in the abatement of regular pollution. When it comes to climate change, I think Congress is going to have to get involved, and we're going to have to be thinking not so much year to year, but decade to decade.
Let me go to the historian very quickly. Professor Turner, the 50 years that we've just finished have been rather radical in the change of approach towards the environment. Is the same sort of trajectory, do you see that unfolding, that pace of change with regards to environmental issues?
I think certainly. I think the environmental problems that we're facing today are bigger and more serious than those, I think, that faced the nation during the Nixon administration. One of the real challenges is that they are less immediately sensible, right? Less immediately, we don't feel them in our lungs the way that we felt smog. We don't see them in our rivers the way that many kinds of water pollution that were addressed by the Clean Water Act. And I think that's one of the real challenges for climate change is how do we help people to see that the things that they can experience, right, in hurricanes, coastal flooding, heat waves, how do we help people to understand that those are a product of human action and response, and that can be changed and mitigated through the actions of government.
Jim Strock, I left you for laugh because you served at both the federal and the state level like Governor Whitman. When you stood up the California EPA, you had just come from the federal EPA. Looking ahead 50 years, who's got the heavy lift here? Is it going to be the states, or is it going to be the federal regulatory scheme that makes science advance and protects the environment?
Hugh, I think it's both. I think the federal role has to change dramatically in a time when the states can clearly take a much bigger leadership role, and also cities. That has not been fully taken into account. Likewise, it'll be more international, and there'll be more of a need for EPA to rise to the challenge in that area. I think there are a lot of lessons from what President Nixon did in 1970, but they're at this point, 50 years on, less about what he did than how he did it. And there, I think there are a lot of lessons we could continue to benefit from.
Okay, you just brought up the international scene, so I want to go around the horn again. Secretary Pompeo came to the Nixon Library in the summer of 2020 to announce basically a revision of American foreign policy vis-a-vis the People's Republic of China and the Chinese Communist Party. President-elect Biden has announced his intention to rejoin the Paris Accords. Governor Whitman, is there going to be any global progress unless or until the People's Republic of China gets serious about their climate commitments?
Well, there will be, and China is beginning to get serious because they are facing some real problems, and they recognize that. I mean, they are building more green energy into their portfolio than many countries, but we're not going to have a seat at the table or an ability to interact or have any impact on what the international community decides, even if we rejoin Paris, if we don't take some steps in this country. We have to take some concrete steps to show that we are serious about this issue. Because right now people don't trust us. We get them to do things that we want them to do, and we had influence on how the Paris Accord, a great deal of influence, and then we walked away from it. So right now we're not seen as a very reliable partner, but the whole world has to be part of this. Mother Nature could care less about geopolitical boundaries. And so it becomes very important that we have a role to play with China. Yes, it's major polluter, but they are taking steps. They're not taking as much or as fast as we'd like, but we're not in any position right now to have any influence on that.
Administrator Reilly, are you optimistic about the People's Republic of China and their arc of environmental activity?
You know, it's very difficult to defend the Chinese policy, even though President Xi made a very important, I think, historic decision when he announced that China would work toward zero emissions over a stated period of time, but quite a long period of time. What he chooses to do and commit to by 2030 is much more important to testing his credibility. But I think that we will have more influence on China. I think that the Chinese, particularly during the period when President Obama and he were both collaborating in making Paris work, and that's worth noting. Without the Chinese, it would not have worked. They brought a number of developing countries along with them. Nevertheless, it remains a fact that the Belt and Road program of the Chinese contemplates and is financing 100 new coal-fired power plants, including in countries that have not been dependent on coal, like Pakistan. They're also on the drawing boards, along with their renewables that Christy mentioned, which are very significant. They've taken the lead, as the world knows, in solar panel development. They nevertheless have 100 coal-fired power plants on the drawing boards, which they are moving ahead with. And one has to conclude that the Belt and Road program, which is their major infrastructure program, is an outlet for their steel and coal resources. That's really what I think they're financing. So they've got to figure out how to integrate an economy that adapts in a very significant way that it has not yet really committed to. I think that the new president of the United States, President-elect Biden, will have influence that we have not previously had with China. I would expect that he will not keep the tariffs. I think that there will be a rapprochement, which the Chinese will welcome. And particularly if we can get the collaboration of India and Prime Minister Modi, I think it will somehow embarrass China. It will cause China to want to be part of that group, assuming that India makes the moves that I think it will make. I'm the co-chair with John Podesta of the U.S.-India Track 2 Climate Task Force. A lot of prominent Indians associated with that. And India is very aware, I think, at that level that they need to move too. So if President-elect Biden moves with both of those countries, I think he will be taken more seriously than his predecessor would have been. And obviously he has a different set of commitments in any event. So I think that's promising and hopeful.
Jim Strock, another of our old friends, Dan Poneman, who was Undersecretary of Energy under President Obama, has written a book this year on the future of the planet depending upon the adoption of nuclear power in a widespread, organic way with a new generation of technology taking root across the world. Are you an optimist about that? Do you see a shift to nuclear in the United States and around the world such that it would replace carbon emissions in a significant way?
Well, I would also point you to a second book this year that's had a big influence in the same space, and that is Michael Schellenberger's recent work. I think the fact is that for a lot of us, if you do the math, the arithmetic, it's very difficult to see how we get to a non-carbon future or a low-carbon future without a much greater penetration of nuclear power. That said, how that technology will be developed, how the regulatory structure will be reformed, it's very old in this country and out of date. These are big questions, and it's very difficult to see how this gets kickstarted without a serious presidential priority. And I think that remains to be seen.
Does anyone disagree with the proposition that nuclear is a necessity for the next 50 years if a clean world is to emerge at 2070? I
would just say, Hugh, I was on the board of the largest electric utility in Texas. We were second. We had two reactors, 2,500 megawatts. Comanche Peak nuclear. And to an environmental regulator, it was a dream. No sulfur dioxides, no particulates, and so forth. It was a question whether we would duplicate, whether we would again build two reactors, which we wanted to do. Everybody on that board was pro-nuclear. The economics utterly failed to pencil out. You could not make new nuclear economically remunerative. I think that the modern smaller nuclear plants will probably be necessary to provide the intense heat and energy necessary for carbon extraction. If it's not that, it's going to have to be natural gas. I don't know what else would do it. So I personally have been supportive of nuclear, and I noticed that the new administration is very supportive of keeping those nuclear plants, which are now so important to us. They provide more than 15% of our electric energy, carbon free too, so that they do not, which otherwise they will, cancel out, which they close down. One has to hope they won't, because replacing them at the pace that we would have to would probably set us back. So the answer is I do support a continuing role for existing nuclear, and I would also support the development of the kinds of energy that's necessary to finance, or rather to power, these carbon extraction plants when they start becoming numerous.
Chris DeMuth,
I would agree with that 100%. I mean, we won't see any more major nuclear reactors built in this country. We saw them try in South Carolina and Georgia a few years back, and we thought that was going to be the breakthrough, and it didn't happen. So that's not going to be it. But the SMRs, the small modular reactors, I really think hold a great deal of hope for the future. And we're also looking at things like molten salt reactors, different ways of producing the nuclear energy that is less problematic, fewer rods to store, fewer leftover energy, as it were, better ways to recycle the energy, that reprocess the energy that is still there in what we have left from our old reactors. But I don't see how we get to the carbon neutral future that we'd like without at least having nuclear as the bridge until we can make the renewables base power and not just peak shaving.
Chris DeMuth, do you agree with that nuclear is a necessity, at least with the technology that we currently possess, not with that which is on the drawing boards and in the minds of creative people, but that which we presently have?
Technology is going to change a lot over the next 50 years. And to sit here and to say that this or that will be necessary, I'm not sure that there's too much meaning to that. In the last decade, nuclear technology has been progressing at a much greater rate than the regulation of that technology. And I think that while we still need some technological breakthroughs, we mainly need regulatory breakthroughs. And I think that the Biden administration will have a great opportunity there because it is going to be an administration, a center-left rather than center-right administration that has the majority of environmental activists within its coalition. It is going to be that coalition that confronts this dilemma over the role of nuclear power and comes up with a new regulatory structure. That's up to them. I have no prediction as to what our new president is going to do in that area, but some of the initial signs are frankly a cause for hope.
Roger Turner, of the victories of the past 50 years in the environmental space, and prior to President Nixon taking office, Rachel Carson had written The Silent Spring. Shortly after he took office, the Cuyahoga River caught on fire. It was a pretty bleak time in 1969 and 1970. What have been the greatest successes of the past 50 years as we look back on those?
Well, I think the recovery of a number of endangered species has been really a tremendous and signal accomplishment. The water being cleaned up is a big deal, and I think Commissioner Reilly made a really excellent point that's really underappreciated about the role of the EPA in helping water utilities and cities build water treatment plants during the 1970s and into the 1980s through federal cost sharing and federal reimbursement programs, which really did change the water quality downstream of cities and water treatment plants. And I think thinking about the ways that EPA might continue to, in the future, really partner with cities and states and localities to to build the kinds of technologies and the kinds of treatment centers that we're going to need in the future, as well as to build out some lower carbon options, could be a really innovative direction to move forward that really echoes and builds on the strengths of the EPA historically.
What I'd like to do now is do the silos that people often fall into, and I don't want to be siloed, but I do want to touch on each of the areas in which the EPA has had significant contributions. Let's begin with water. And Governor Whitman, clean water, I know you're a critic of the outgoing administration. Administrator Wheeler is my friend, so is Administrator Pruitt, but they were both very, very, very committed to clean water, as I know you were. Does the world get it yet? Is the world on top of the risk to the water supply and the necessity of keeping it as clean as we have brought it to the point of being in the United States now and continue to work on?
Oh, I think the world recognizes the importance of clean water because they've seen the impacts of what happens when you don't have clean water. I just think that most of them think it's beyond their ability, if we're talking about the average person, to have any impact on it. And they also, many people don't understand that what comes out of the sky is not necessarily clean. That in fact, there's a great deal that happens to it, particularly in this country, but unless you have a well the way we do, that you have to clean it. It isn't anybody who drives a car or puts anything outside and goes out after a rainstorm and looks at it knows that it's dirty. And that's because of the PM 2.5 that's in the atmosphere and that comes down with the rain. So people are understanding that. I mean, they know they want clean water, but they're not always willing to pay for what it will take to deliver that water. In the developed countries, particularly. In the developing countries, it's more, they just need to get water. And particularly the sub-Sahara, you're seeing the impacts of climate change with the extensive droughts that they've had and how that's changed lifestyles entirely. So just the access to water there is a huge, huge issue. While they'd like clean water, the most important thing for them is just to get water. And in the developed world, it's more a question of we don't pay what we really need to pay in order to have the kind of clean water that we need.
Jim Strock, in California, where you helmed the agency responsible for the water supply and the cleanliness of it, they didn't build really in the last 20 years any significant infrastructure to advance water collection and purification in California. It's a no-win political issue. How do you change that?
Well, Hugh, I think it's going to come through leadership of people who get out there like President Nixon or people on this panel who worked with him and begin to explain it. As you know, in California in particular, but it's not unique in this way, infrastructure has been underinvested in general for many years, despite rising population and so forth. So it's a major, major problem going ahead. One way it could be helped, I think, is if it can be combined with some technological development that comes out of here that we can help export.
Administrator Reilly, Israel seemed to have put first water infrastructure, the best in the world at recovery and reuse, of the best in the world at conservation, they're the best in the world at water science. Why does no one else even come remotely close to how the Israelis approach water?
Well, the Israelis were up against a climate and an environment that was extremely hostile. I can recall when the intake pumps in the Sea of Galilee, Kinneret, were just barely above the level of the lake. And it's a key source of water for Israelis. So they developed, they had at one time 12 different desalination plants on the agenda. I was in the water field, a private equity firm. I was going to finance some of those. Did make a major investment in Israel in water, and they they did what they had to do. We have not had to do it. It has not been so drastic, such a severe challenge. I would point out, though, that if you look at some of the achievements on water, even and apart from infrastructure responses, which I agree have been insufficient, and we need more of them. Los Angeles area doubled its population over the last, 25, 30 years without increasing the aggregate use of water. I believe that Seattle did the same thing. So our cities have become more efficient users of water. Deindustrialization has had some part in that too. The kind of thing that is really, I think, going to cause infrastructure to play an important role will be the encroachment of the sea in so many of our cities. I recall when a hurricane wiped out the beach in Miami, the United States spent something like $1 billion restoring it, rebuilding it. And I can remember Haley Barbour telling his people when the oil spill was threatening, protect the wetlands, protect the marshes. If the oil gets in there, we'll never get it out. Forget the beaches. We built the beaches and we can build them again. So we're going to see, I think, particularly the coastal Republican senators and Congress members become advocates of significant infrastructure investments to adapt their environments to the new reality about sea level rise. I think that's what's going to make possible a bipartisan approach to infrastructure. And I think that the president-elect has pretty much made this clear, will embed his climate proposals within an a renewable energy policy, an R&D approach, an infrastructure approach that can be more palatable to Republicans, and without necessarily calling the whole thing climate change, which is troublesome for a party that largely doesn't recognize it, then I think it can happen.
Governor Whitman, are you that optimistic about infrastructure meeting the needs of desalinization and coastal protection?
I am. I mean, it's a reality, particularly for the governors. I mean, these and the mayors. It's the governors and the mayors that are going to be driving this. I mean, we always say the states are the laboratories of democracy. And in this case, this is where the rubber meets the road. This is where you have to respond. You have people who are losing their homes. Every time you have these saltwater intrusions, we know that changes the ecosystem, and the next storm goes in even further. So more and more homes and places are being impacted, and you get combined sewer overflow and sanitary sewer overflow, which becomes a serious problem in these communities. So they're having to deal with that now. The Regional Plan Association, which lays out, does a lot of investigation and planning for the New York, New Jersey, Connecticut area region, has put out a plan about, oh gosh, it must have been about 7 years ago now, that detailed the impact on the coastal communities of these states from sea level rise. And that really brought it home to a lot of these mayors and to the governors that we've got to start doing things now. And that means investment, which is tough to do when all the economies are strained, and particularly now with this pandemic and what it's doing to our economies. But I would also go back and say, you look at the pandemic, and guess what, gang? I think climate change has had some impact on these kinds of things happening to us when ecosystems. Can
you expand on that? I don't. Would you expand on how climate change and the pandemic go hand in hand, Governor?
Yeah, I mean, again, I'm not a scientist, so this is going outside of my wheelhouse. But when you see the climate change, you see ecosystems change and pathogens change. I live on a farm. We're seeing very different invasive species than we have had before, that we just have never seen before. People are coming in contact, animals are moving because they're losing their habitat, and they're coming in more contact with humans. They carry diseases that we don't know about, not necessarily in this country. Maybe what we've seen with this pandemic is it didn't originate here, whether it was just in Wuhan, China, or whether it was in Europe and other places as well. But they're tracing it back to the wet markets. They're tracing it back to human-animal interaction as part of the way it is spread. I think we have to expect more of this kind of thing as we see the ecosystems change.
And my second area where a lot of progress was made by President Nixon, I mentioned the National Environmental Policy Act. It brought the public into the arena. And Jim Strock, I'm going to blame you for not curing California of the California Environmental Quality Act and the paperwork that it generates while you were the head of the CalEPA. But how do you keep the public participatory but avoid what has been forests? Amazon level destruction of paper to produce environmental impact reports that neither advance the environmental quality of a project nor the return on investment. Why did you fail to fix that, Jim?
Thank you, Hugh.
Yeah, Jim.
Most everything else was finished. Thank you for noticing that one thing. As you know, Hugh, and from your private law practice as well as your public service, one of the problems with NEPA and CEQA in particular is that parties have found ways to use them who have non-environmental motivations. It's made it much more complicated. That plainly needs reform. the whole way the government deals with information of this nature, whether it's FOIA or the state equivalents or this kind of process, are entirely out of date. So I think this is an area that's just ripe for entirely new thinking and needs to be done soon. And a quick thought on this, as you know, so for example, when people on this call and President Nixon started the EPA in 1970, they were working downstream from intellectual policy, empirical work from the 50s and 60s. We're 50 years out of date. So it's to be expected in the digital age, this area has to be entirely recast.
I want to go to Chris DeMuth on this. Chris, I helped President Nixon design and build the library back in 1989 and 1990. And we were designing an exhibit on the Endangered Species Act. And Jim mentioned my private law practice. It's been primarily ESA and Clean Water Act driven. I'm retired now. But he asked me what I thought about the ESA. And I said, what were you thinking? It's a nightmare. And he said, well, it seemed like a good idea at the time. And it's because it was never used for the purpose for which it was originally intended. How much of the original agenda got off track through citizen participation, citizen standing, and what Jim just referred to, cross-purposing environmental rules and regulations and laws to a no-growth agenda?
If you go down into the library, you will find that the enrolled bill memo, which is what the president gets when he decides to sign or veto a bill, on the National Environmental Quality Act in December of 1969, was written by me. And it said, all of the departments are complaining that this thing called an environmental impact statement is going to gum up the works. It's going to slow everything down. Don't take that seriously, Mr. President. It's not going to be a problem. This is simply a cautionary, before we make an investment, think about the environmental impacts as well as the traffic impacts, this, that, and the other thing. It's just a good, sensible program. Of course, I also knew that he was going to sign it. And so I was tailoring my advice. That turned out to be wrong. And there are grounds for legitimate argument about this. But I think it's a classic case of not just unintended but perverse consequences. The environmental impact statements have become an arm of the anti-growth wing of the environmental movement, which is often bad for the environment. Growth gives us the means to cope with environmental problems better than in the past. And turning this question over to lawyers and judges and holding down the construction of replacement bridges, other improvements in infrastructure, as in my view, and as I say, people can disagree with this, but I think it's a pretty massive step away from environmental improvement. So, and I think that in many ways, opening up government decisions to popular public participation has been a good thing. You can say it's an inevitable thing. In a highly educated, politically active world, we're all going to demand that government decisions not be made by a few people in cloistered agencies. People are going to have to pay attention to the public. It's a good thing. In any event, it's our world. But narrow interest groups and factions can capture the process. They can use regulation for selfish interests. They can deflect government rules, including in the environmental area, away from what would actually be good and improving for the environment. And it has been a greatly over-lawyered exercise in many respects. And the endangered species successes I know most about, for example, with the bald eagle, have primarily been a case of direct government action as opposed to regulation.
I want to say a good word on behalf of all the environmental activists who are watching. Natural Resources Defense Council leader, lawyer, Joel Reynolds is a good friend of mine. And over the years, we've crossed swords, but he always had the environment at the center of his agenda. And I believe most environmental activists do. But Roger Turner what do you say to that side of the political spectrum about the abuses of the laws that are intended to save the planet for other purposes? Is there any changing minds there, changing hearts?
Well, those laws giving citizens standing to sue and to compel the government to do what the laws require it to do were put in there very, very consciously as a way to try and prevent the regulatory capture that has become so often the case with lots of different regulatory agencies. And those, and that's a significant capacity that citizens have used a lot. One of the ways that we might think about going forward, breaking through some of those log jams, is to increase the expertise and the capacity, the governance capacity within agencies, so that it doesn't only become a tug of war between two different groups of lawyers. And I think that's a place where the decades-long underinvestment in the skill and the expertise and the capacity of governing of the agencies of our government, right? So our bureaucrats and the people who work inside of government agencies is really come back to hurt us, right? So we need to spend more and invest more on the people inside who work for the people of the United States.
Governor Whitman,
I want to enter a dissent on some of this. I think we're pushing this too far, as though this is an obstructive law that has not been productive. The wording of the law, the statute, is those statements were to be prepared on major federal actions significantly affecting the quality of the human environment. The mistake may have been that they were applied. I wrote the first regulations for this statute, by the way, at the Council on Environmental Quality. The major has not been defined in a way that would, I think, satisfy some of the concerns about efficiency and duplication. But I just want to recall that the first time that statute was applied to block development was the Trans-Alaska Pipeline. I was the receiving officer for that environmental impact statement. And I remember the judge wrote in his own hand, failure to comply with the National Environmental Policy Act. Well, the Interior Department went through 2 iterations. They finally produced a 3,000-page analysis. And the proponent of the Trans-Alaska Pipeline, the chairman and CEO of Atlantic Richfield, commented that the criticisms that had been made by environmentalists significantly improved the safety of the 8 river crossings and also the fortification against earthquakes. He complimented that. And I pointed out to President George H.W. Bush when his vice president and his chief of staff were complaining about environmental criticism of our response to ExxonMobil, to the Exxon Valdez, that environmentalists had predicted there was a 1 in 1,000 chance of a major spill involving a tanker coming down Prince William Sound. And this was the 876th trip. So it's not a one-sided story that it's been obstruction, inefficiency, excessive paper. There's a lot of that to it, but it's not kept us from doing important things. I think that the failure to do big things in the country is much more a lack of ambition and commitment to do big things and political reconciliation and bipartisanship than it is of environmental obstruction.
A good caution, Administrator. Governor, I want to have you celebrate, if you can, one of the big, I think, unmitigated wins. The regulation of pesticides and dangerous chemicals in the United States was simply not done prior to the Nixon administration's arrival and then into the Carter years as well. And now I believe one has to look at the American record and say the science is good when it comes to the chemicals that might kill and the pollutants that might damage. Do you agree with me on that?
I do. I mean, I think the science is there. The issue I think we have today, that I believe we have today, is we don't always listen to that science in the way that we should and credit it the way that we should, because we're finding out new things. I mean, some of the pesticides we've determined that the agency had thought were problematic turn out not to have been so problematic, and that's fine, and it should be recognized, and we need to retweak those particular regulations or do away with them. But there are others that, in fact, are very problematic that we have yet to take the kinds of steps toward regulating that we need to take. But science is evolving, and that's one of the important things that the agency does. It's its capacity with its scientists to continuously upgrade and determine what is safe for human health and what isn't. And we learn new things every single day. But I would agree with you that overall, this is the kind of thing that the agency was established to do. And because of its depth, the depth that it has had in the past with real science, with hard science, that has been its strength. That is what's given it its credibility, because it's not, while there are always policy implications on every decision, every regulation that you put, they should be based on science, not on politics. And there's a difference between policy and politics. And we need to make sure that we continue to pursue that and encourage people to understand this is how decisions are made. You're never going to like all of them. Some regulations are going to drive you nuts. But the point is, if they're based on good, sound science, then they're doing their job and everyone benefits from that down the line.
Jim Strock, if you can return to your time as head of enforcement at the EPA in DC, do you believe Americans have generally internalized a compliance attitude towards environmental regulations? My point of view is yes. People want to be good actors. That may not have been the case in 1969. What was your experience at the EPA when you were running enforcement? What's your belief now?
Well, first, let me say that I was honored to serve a president, the first President Bush, who made a stronger commitment on this than anybody I'm aware of in US history publicly. And I was reporting to Administrator Reilly, who made this a top priority. So I'll just say this as a preface to hopefully his comments. I believe it has been very successful in this respect. And I think that's one of the biggest changes that EPA has wrought. And of course, it was no accident. Bill Ruckelshaus made that explicitly a top priority when he came in 1970. He did again when he returned in 1983. And his own background as a lawyer and prosecutor and legislator made that a very real area for accomplishment.
Administrator Reilly, you want to add to that?
Well, I just would say that, by the way, Jim Strock was a fabulous enforcer. We had the best enforcement record, in fact, more convictions, as I recall, more settlements than in the previous 18-year history of the agency. I would just quote the principal pollster for President George H.W. Bush when he advised prior to the campaign in 1988. He said, "The environment has entered the DNA of the American people. It is there to stay." So I agree with you, Hugh, that it's a reality. I think there's a sense of indifference, I guess, to the vigor that we might now wish to see applied to some of the environmental problems that are not getting addressed, like climate change. I think that the public, to a large extent, as was mentioned in your introduction, thinks that some of these problems have been solved because we have been very successful with the more manifest, the more obvious, the more personally offensive pollutants. Before we close, Hugh, I want to recount an encounter with President Nixon.
Oh, please.
When I was administrator, I attended a lecture that he delivered at the Plaza Hotel in New York, and it was a fabulous lecture. Toured the world really without any notes. He had all the key ambassadors present. Everybody respected his worldview. And he particularly said, we have to be very attentive to our relationship with China. Among the most important reasons is because we'll never get any international cooperation on the environment if we don't. And I was quite taken by that connection. And I went up to talk to him and he looked at me and he smiled. He said, "I know you, you're the EPA guy. I see you on television. You know, I created EPA." And then he said, what did he say? He said, "Who was that first guy that I put over, the fellow that with the funny name?" I said, "Ruckelshaus." He said, "Do you ever see him?" I said, "Yes, sir, I do. He's a close friend." He said, well, he did a good job for me. Give him my regards if you see him." And I remember wondering whether the Saturday Night Massacre didn't matter to him anymore or he'd forgotten it. but at any rate, he said, "You know, I did create EPA. I'm an environmentalist, but you got to keep it out of the hands of the nuts. That stuff in California, that initiative out there, that's nuts. And I've forgotten what initiative it was. Probably Jim Strock would remember.
Prop 65, I think, in 1987, I expect.
It could have been that, or it could have been the Coastal Commission, Jim. San Clemente was, the library did not get built in San Clemente because of Coastal Commission issues for a long time. Chris DeMuth, if I could ask you to go back in the time machine as well. It is a Nixon Library audience. John Whitaker is the fellow who first passed off the foundation to me in 1989. President Nixon had a lot of environmentalists. I mean, not just Administrator Reilly and not just you, but John Whitaker and John Ehrlichman. And the time, people don't remember this. Can you expand on how that was part of the agenda in 1969?
That is well said. Yep.
Yes, and I first got involved in August of 1969. In the White House, we'd just been through a battle royal over welfare policy. And the president was looking ahead. And I got summoned into the Oval Office along with John Ehrlichman and John Whitaker, both of whom were committed environmentalists. Whitaker was a geologist. Ehrlichman had been a land use lawyer in Seattle, very attuned to conservation issues. And the president said he wanted me to work on his first State of the Union address, which would be in January of 1970. He'd been there for a year, but when you come in, you give an inaugural address. And this was going to be a new decade. He believed that the issues of the 1970s domestically were going to be very different from what they'd been in previous decades, where the issues had been economic growth, employment, prerogatives of union and management, and so forth. He thought that very different issues were coming to the forefront, and he emphasized two: environmental quality and women's rights, which were somewhat in the background. The Equal Rights Amendment was being debated. There'd been the fire on the Cuyahoga. There'd been the oil spill off of Santa Barbara. These things were starting to perk. He wanted to get ahead of the curve on these issues. And my instructions were to come up with, first of all, to see what the government was doing. He knew that there were these little programs scattered around different agencies, uncoordinated. He thought that they were probably weak and ineffective. He was right about that. He wanted them to be strengthened. And he said, Scoop Jackson, who was the author of the Environmental Statement Policy Act, and Ed Muskie, who was getting ready to strengthen the air and water pollution control programs. I remember he said, Senator Muskie would close down all of American industry. I won't do that. But I do want a much stronger program than we've ever had before. And so he instructed me to put together a task force. And apropos the enforcement issue, he said, keep Maury Stans off of it. Maury was Secretary of Commerce. He said, if Maury finds out what we're doing, he'll have all of his business chums here at the White House and he'll shut down the whole thing. I will call him the week before the State of the Union address. I'll tell him what we're going to do. And Chris, I will protect you. And he did. And Maury eventually came on board. It was a little bit of a shock that this administration was going to be involved in a new level of regulation of major American businesses. And the president was committed to doing something. He wanted something strong and effective, moderate to some extent, but he understood that we had to keep the business community at arm's length for a little bit of time. And I think that that was a sort of a precursor to what under Bill Ruckelshaus and then under successors, including two here, was an important emphasis on enforcement.
You know, I'd like to conclude by going around the horn, and I'm not going to include you in this, Dr. Turner, but we are all Republicans here. And I've always believed that Teddy Roosevelt showed the way. And Jim Strock, you wrote a book about TR. I think the only way for the Republican Party to be viable long-term is to be an environmentalist party and to be an activist environmental party. Do you agree with that? And if so, how do you see that? I mean, we all love clean air. We got to clean up the Superfund sites. That's all got to happen. But how do you articulate that? And I'll just walk down the road here and get everybody's 2 cents, and we'll wrap up with Professor Turner. Jim?
Well, Hugh, I'd say first, I'm representative of a subset in the electorate in that I'm not a Republican now. I'm independent for many years, in part because of my disaffection on these issues. And I believe one of the great contributions of President Nixon that is underappreciated is that he was able to bring, as Chris DeMuth has said so well, environmental concerns into the conservative center-right side of the discussion and have a competition between Muskie and Jackson and Nixon and so on. I think when you compare today, the Conservative Party in Great Britain, the Christian, the CDU, CSU coalition in Germany, you see much more effective competition left and right to the benefit of the public on the environment. And I think that President Nixon offers a really important lesson, template, and inspiration that ought to be reconsidered in this respect.
Governor Whitman.
President Nixon was visionary on this. There's just no question about it. And environment is a Republican issue. The first president to set aside public lands was Abraham Lincoln. We know what Teddy Roosevelt did with the national parks. And then you have Richard Nixon, who not only established EPA, but if you think about the Clean Water Act and the Safe Drinking Water Act, all the things that were part of that were NEPA, the things that he implemented are extraordinary and far-reaching. We are the beneficiaries of his commitment to making the environment safer and healthier. And then, of course, you have under Administrator Reilly and George H.W. Bush, the Clean Air Act amendments. This is a Republican issue. It has been, and it should continue to be, because everybody is vested in a clean and healthy environment.
Administrator Reilly.
You know, it's interesting that Jim mentions the British situation. I think that Nixon was kind of a Disraeli figure in many ways. He gave electoral and Republican respectability to an issue that had not previously been thought, and really most of the years since has not been considered by Republicans their issue. I once asked Prime Minister Thatcher why it was that in Britain there seemed to be so little ideological conflict about environment and environmental protection. And she said, well, I think it's pretty simple. We're just a highly dense and developed little island, and we have to get along. Well, that's an interesting insight about community and the need to do things together if you really want to tackle something important. I'm so pleased, Chris, that you mentioned the sulfur dioxide tax proposal and the lead tax proposal. Nobody ever mentions that. I don't think anybody remembers it. Maybe you and me.
And I do.
But we worked on that at the Council on Environmental Quality,
Right.
The SO2 tax particularly. And Nixon was ahead of his time. I think he would have approved the Clean Air Act amendments that George H.W. Bush proposed,
Sure.
the acid rain market-based regulatory approach, which has proved more effective, more cost-effective than even we who were proponents of it and who drafted it ever thought it would be. That is a milestone that we can learn from. There are market-based approaches to many of these problems that have not been fully explored, and they work with incentives, less with compulsion. I think that's got to be the way the Republican Party gets back into the environmental game, and I very much hope it will.
Chris DeMuth, you want to add to that?
Let me add to the Republican pantheon of environmental leaders, Barry Goldwater, who was a committed environmentalist and in many ways ahead of his time. I want to recognize that along with being in favor of clean air and water and a healthy environment, Americans are very individualistic, liberty-minded, suspicious of bureaucracies, jealous of their own freedoms. And that too is part of the world that we live in. And there has been over the 50 years of the EPA a lot of opposition to the EPA because of the perception that it is bureaucratic and regulatory and coming up with all sorts of detailed rules and regulations that we have to live by, and I don't even understand why they're making me do this. This too is part of our culture. I myself regret the fact that the partisan back and forth has led Republicans into the position of opposing bureaucracy and overregulation without at the same time tying itself to a strong environmental agenda that would blend a commitment to environmental improvement with a recognition that we have issues of economic liberty and personal freedom that we have to deal with as well. It's a complicated problem. And to simply say, I'm against federal regulation, it really doesn't answer any questions. So I think we need a more sophisticated approach going forward.
And Dr. Turner, to you, the last word.
Well, one of the people that I have studied as a historian is a man named Arnold Beckman, who was a PhD chemist who gave up a professorship at Caltech to start a business creating scientific instruments, manufacturing scientific instruments during the Great Depression. And he built a Fortune 500 company, became the LA Chamber of Commerce's sort of point man on smog and air pollution when he saw that air pollution was really threatening the growth of Los Angeles, to the point where banks were talking about not issuing new mortgages to people or not investing in new mortgages for people moving to Los Angeles. And he's also, was a very staunch conservative. And there's, you look through his archives and you see photo after photo of dull gray boxes of chemical instruments, and then you come to the next folder and it's picture after picture of him shaking hands with the leaders of the California Republican Party, national Republican leaders. And he played this crucial role in connecting scientists with policy to address smog. And California was especially Southern California was the real leader, and in many ways the kind of the template for how the Clean Air Act would be implemented. So I think there is this rich legacy of Republicans and conservatives embracing what science can provide and letting science be a powerful voice in thinking about and understanding the problems that we all face, that society faces, and thinking about good solutions to that. And I think that's a place where we can look to history for real inspiration going forward.
Well, I want to thank each of you. I want to especially thank you, Dr. Turner, for allowing me to thank the Beckman Foundation, which has made possible our third permanent new installation at the library this year on President Nixon and his environmental legacy, along with our Title IX exhibit on President Nixon, the women in his family, the women in his White House, and the women that he served, and the President's Club exhibit and the Yom Kippur War exhibit. Thank you all for joining us on this occasion. In 50 years, maybe one of us will be around, Professor Turner, but all of us, our grandkids maybe, can watch this and enjoy that we were celebrating 50 years in on the way to 100. Thank you all for joining us.